also confirmation on a few runestones that Vikings were not only feared outside of Scandinavia on the continent, but there are occasional runestones that tell stories about him or her being a guard against Vikings here in Scandinavia as well. Scandinavian Today modern science and stunning new discoveries reveal who these Scandinavian adventurers really were. The Swedes, Norwegians, and Danes spoke the same language and worshipped the same pagan gods, but we shall see that it was their life and death relationship with the sea that defined Viking culture for centuries. Before the Viking era, the Scandinavian populations buried their dead in ship-shaped stone graves called ship settings, such as these two on the windswept island of Iran that stand side by side with meanies as entrances to the world of the dead. So it is a ship motif that recurs above ground, and it is supposed to be visible in that way. Then the burials in the big ones are in most cases only common cremation, so to speak, the cremation layer as it is called. But then we have first and foremost from the middle of the Viking era and in the late Viking era great quantities of ship burials where they actually burned the boats far across the Bicc on the island of Sima in Estonia. No less than 40 Viking warriors were excavated in 2011. They were buried in 2 boat graves. When the carbon dating results came back, director of the history faculty at Tallinn University Epets was shocked to find out that the ships dated back to 650 AD. These were pre-Viking Age Vikings. That makes them previous Vikings of the previous Viking Age according to the Estonian calendar, the Vendel Age according to Swedish chronology, and the Moravian Age according to the European chronology. The bodies found in the Saaremaa ships had been hacked to death. Battle they died and must have been major if 40 men were killed and enough survivors were left to bury them. We can say for sure that it was a battle burial ceremony, but there was a serious battle with more than 40 victims in 2 ships. Says it all. The battle had to be hard. We can see vicious wounds on the skeletons, for example. Hacked hands and broken heads, so it was hard and they had to bury those victims fast. The men who died on Sima Island were buried with full military honors. Riley Alma is an anthropologist, and was amazed at the care with which they were laid to rest. I think that this burial was done with great respect because we can see separated body parts, heads, hands, or legs, but they were buried in an anatomically correct order. I think that this is a very important sign that they were buried with high respect. The strontium isotope readings from the enamel of the teeth of the Samar warriors suggest they originate from Sweden. Around Lake Mälaren. North of Lake Mälaren lies Valor, the heart of a thriving previous Viking Age Scandinavian community where noble men and women were buried with rich grave goods for centuries before the first recorded Viking raid. As we shall see, the massive Lake Mälaren was the gateway to the Baltic for communities like these. Here Inger Jensen found the best preserved previous Viking Age burial site in this part of Scandinavia. The first grave of this kind dates from about 600, thus the beginning of what we call the Vendel era. But anyway, it's just one man that's laid out like that, intact. All the other families, they lie in simple graves. You don't see them over there in a pile crated. These Vendel-era boat graves were rich in artifacts buried with the dead objects they believed would serve in the afterlife, including magnificent helmets. They give us an insight into the lives of these pre-Viking adventurers, and the man lies in the middle of the boat surrounded by his weapons. The Vendel era was a prosperous period, so they would bury 3 shields, and there would be other things too, such as drinking vessels, horns, and glass from France, and so on. The cemetery shows how cremation and boat burial went together. In the previous Viking era, noble women were buried with their typical oval brooches. There was a woman buried over there in a 2 m high mound. She was buried with glass, pearls, and bronze jewelry, and so on. But the one thing that was so special was a little dragon head that must have been made out of some kind of ivory. A woman was the owner of the finest ship grave ever found. It was uncovered in a burial mound at Åre south of Oslo and dates to the earliest part of the Viking Age. The ship now stands in the Oslo Viking Ship Museum, directed by Yen B. During the excavation, it became clear that even though there weren't 2 complete skeletons in the grave, it did contain the remains of 2 distinct individuals. It was also evident that they were probably female. This was confirmed by the osteological examinations, and they also confirmed that the remains were from an older and a younger woman. Archaeology confirmed terms how ships were central to Scandinavian society, and how rich men and women would literally take them to the grave. The powerful lady who owned the ship was in her 80s and was buried with a cart, a sledge, and a slave woman aged about 50 whose DNA can be traced to populations living around the Caspian Sea, the furthest east the Vikings ever went. Dendrochronology, or study of tree rings revealed the ship's place of origin. It was only later, when other dendrochronological examinations of two ship findings from Kar in West Norway were carried out, that it was suddenly possible to find an exact match with the tree ring characteristics from the Oberberg ship. When it was possible to demonstrate that the tree ring pattern seen in the wood from the Oberberg ship was the same that was seen in the ships and the grave on Karo, then it was possible to state that the Oberberg ship must have been built in that same area of West Norway. The ship sailed for decades in the early 9th century before it was buried with the Old Lady of Oer. It was built here on Karoya Island, Western Norway. Marit Vea leads the excavations at Errol Nes. The seat of the first kings of the Northmen. Norway is named after a sea lane, and this Northway started here when people in the olden days came sailing past the open Yaya coast. Just when they turned north, common outside here is like a road of water, so this is where the Northway started. This is where the story of the first Viking raiders of the west started. The homeland of the terrifying predators of the sea. The story of the Vikings starts many centuries before the first recorded attack. The sea was the lifeblood of the Nordic communities that lived along these rocky shores of Karoya Island in modern-day Norway. The Vikings here lived and died by their ship's ship. The ship grave on its own is a manifestation, a communication with the gods. In a way, it's almost like a theatrical play where you are connecting with the gods, and it wasn't like they made these graves in a couple of days. There were a lot of rituals, and they stood open several months. We can see that on the logs that we found in the graves. The sagas written in Iceland 2 centuries after the end of the Viking era, record stories passed on orally by Norse poets from one generation to the next of the first kings of Ol and the last saga from Ovol's ancestors. The king at Arneskwa, he traveled all the way to Siberia, which the Norse people called Bamaland. There he met a Mongolian princess of Siberian ancestry, and to ensure the whale hunt trade he married her and brought her back to Arles, and so there was a dark-skinned queen here on Arles. Although for hundreds of kilometers northwards, Norwegian geography offers nothing but mountains and deep fields, perfect for sheltering ships from the Atlantic gales, but hopeless for farming. Here, local chieftain found a profitable way of exploiting the rocky coastline by extorting aid from rich merchants passing through. They sent their ships out to control the sea traffic, and it is this channel outside
see this floating bubble video I'm in?
And turn Arnes into a center of power
Studio.
for 3,000
you can use
years.
it to
One
share
has
your
to be
screen,
clear about
stream
the fact
online
that
for free,
voyages down
and
to
even
the
record
continent from Sweden
YouTube videos.
and Scandinavia
I record
were something
all of this with OBS
that had
Studio.
been going on many years before the period that we call the Viking era. In that way, the Vikings only followed an already well-worn path. We know that the contacts between the continent and Sweden and Scandinavia were comprehensive and extensive already during the early Iron Age. Evidence of ancient trade links with the east along Russia's rivers were found here on the shores of Lake Mälaren in Sweden, where archaeologists found this bronze Buddha dating back to 750 at Buha. Then yes, the little Buddha statue was found in the 1950s in a settlement on an island outside of Stockholm named Halo. It was found in a house there. We know that it was made in today's
We have
Pakistan
moments where we
in the
sell
Swat Valley,
thousands
and
of
that it
products
dates to
in just
about
under 2
400
minutes.
years
With
after
Shopify, we
Crystal
don't have
and Bika
to
were trading
question
in
whether
Korea
it
on
will-
Lake Mälaren
दोस्तों
near
आज के वीडियो में
Stockholm,
बात
here
करने
on
जा रहे हैं
Alelo
एक बिल्कुल
Island on the
नए
other
लाइव
side of the
स्ट्रीमिंग
lake from
सॉफ्टवेयर के
Berkeley,
बारे
the
में।
local chief's
इसकी कुछ
tax.
मैंने वीडियो यूट्यूब पर
And
देखी थी
extorted
तो लोग
protected
इस सॉफ्टवेयर का
disposable
नाम
wealth
है
that they could spread
मेल्ट
among
पर
their
आपको क्लिक
followers. There
करके
was a
सॉफ्टवेयर
long
को
hosea
डाउनलोड कर
port
लेना है।
and reception
जैसे ही आप
halls
उस लिंक
as the
पर
seat
क्लिक
of
करोगे
political
आप
power.
इस
It was
वेबसाइट
built
पर
at a
पहुंच
healthy
जाओगे।
distance
स्ट्रीम
from
विद
the
कॉन्फिडेंस
industrial
वी विल
town where
हैंडल द
traders and
कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी।
craftsmen labored in grimy and filthy conditions. Long the layers of waste are so thick, and there is so much garbage that lies inside these places. You must also remember that many of these places, first and foremost, Bika had no natural surrounding areas out on the farms. They removed the waste that they used as manure for the fields and
यहाँ
things
पर
like
एक
that.
डाउनलोड
But in
का
these
ऑप्शन आ रहा
places
है।
that
ये
space was
सॉफ्टवेयर
missing.
100%
Other
फ्री
trading
सॉफ्टवेयर
towns
है,
grew
कोई
and faded
वाटरमार्क
away
आपको
in
यहाँ नहीं
Norway.
मिलेगा।
All that is
साथ ही
left
साथ
of
कोई लिमिट नहीं है, जितनी
Sun
देर
on
आप
the
चाहो
shore
लाइव
of
इसको
Oslo
डेमो
Fjord
वगैरह
are a
इसका
few
दिया
mounds
गया है।
dating
तो
back
सबसे
to the
पहले
earliest
सॉफ्टवेयर
years
को
of the
अपने
Viking
पीसी पर
Age. As
डाउनलोड कर
Bika
लेना है,
here, a
इंस्टॉल कर लेना है। यहाँ पर
powerful
डाउनलोड का
military
बटन आ रहा है,
tax
डाउनलोड पर
trade
क्लिक
in
कर देना है। अब
exchange
यहाँ
for
पर
what
आपको
we can
दो
see in
ऑप्शन
the
देखने
whole
को
of
मिलेंगे,
Europe is
एक
that when
विंडोज
these
का,
early
दूसरा
cities
मैक
rise,
ओएस
they
का।
have
अब
connections
जो भी
to
आपका
kings
ऑपरेटिंग
and the
सिस्टम है
powerful
उसके हिसाब से आप इसके वर्जन
Can
को
be
डाउनलोड कर
direct
सकते
cities
हो। आप
need
देख रहे हो
protection.
इंस्टॉल पर
They
क्लिक
need
से ओपन
military
करते हैं तो इस
protection
तरह का
because
इंटरफेस
trade is
देखने को
not a
मिलता है। यहाँ पर
barbaric
हमें
thing, it's a
काफी
peaceful
सिंपल
thing, and
इंटरफेस
tradesmen
देखने
are
को
mostly
मिलता है। फाइल
engaged
का
in
ऑप्शन
other
आ रहा है,
things
एडिट
than
का
war. They
ऑप्शन,
want
व्यू का
protection.
ऑप्शन, हेल्प
Sign
का
on the
ऑप्शन
edge
है।
of Norway's
और यहाँ
Oslo
पर आप देख रहे हो, यहाँ पर जो
actually
आपका
revealed
डिस्क
surprising
स्पेस है वो भी यहाँ पर शो हो रहा है और 60 FPS यहाँ पर शो हो रहा है। गो लाइव का बटन है, रिकॉर्ड का बटन है, क्लिप का बटन है और यहाँ पर आपका ही साथ इस साइड आप देखोगे तो यहाँ पर लेयर्स करते हैं, उसमें आपको सोर्सेज करके आता है और कैप्चर यहाँ से ऐड कर सकते हो। मीडिया सोर्स अगर ऐड करना हो तो यहाँ से कर सकते हो। इमेज ऐड करने का ऑप्शन है और ब्राउजर सोर्स का ऑप्शन यहाँ मिल जाता है। करनी है करो और उसके बाद यहाँ पर ऑप्शन आएगा सिलेक्ट अ डिवाइस। सिलेक्ट डिवाइस में आप अपना वेब कैमरा जो भी है वो ऐड कर लूंगा। इसी आपको एक सोर्स यहाँ पर ऐड कर जाता है, यहाँ से आप पूरी सेटिंग्स कर सकते हो जैसे
pillaging themselves where they could arm to the teeth and ready for anything, so we don't have clear traces of plunder there, but at the same time they did plunder other places that's obvious. And we have
तो इस वीडियो में मैं आपको दिखाने वाला हूँ कैसे आप YouTube पर लाइव स्ट्रीम कर सकते हो बहुत ही आसानी से विद अ फ्री सॉफ्टवेयर। कोई वाटरमार्क नहीं होता है।
Made into the jewelry
Let's see
that
how.
we found
तो
lying
इस
in the
पूरे
graves, the most ancient power center found in Denmark was a chieftain's camp at
वेबसाइट
Alare, close
पे
to
ये
the
प्रिज्म
modern
लाइव
city of
स्टूडियो की
Brazil, on the
वेबसाइट है और
island
यहाँ
of
आप सिंपली
Zealand. The
डाउनलोड
ancient burial grounds and the royal halls here date back to the
सकते हो एंड डाउनलोड होने के बाद इंस्टॉल कर सकते हो। इसके बाद आप सीधा सॉफ्टवेयर को इंस्टॉल कर सकते हो जैसे आप कोई भी और सॉफ्टवेयर करते हो। इंस्टॉल होने के बाद यू विल गेट दिस स्क्रीन ऑफ एलिवेट योर लाइव स्ट्रीम। सिंपली क्लिक ऑन स्टार्ट। जब ये स्टार्ट हो रहा है तब तक ये बताना चाहूंगा प्रिज्म लाइव स्टूडियो एब्सोल्युटली फ्री है एंड इसमें काफी ऐसे तगड़े फीचर्स हैं दैट एक्चुअली मेक इट वे मोर यूजफुल देन इवन OBS। एंड तभी मैं ये वीडियो बना रहा हूँ। तो सब कुछ इंस्टॉल करने के बाद और लॉग इन करने के बाद आपके पास सामने कुछ ऐसा इंटरफेस आएगा ऑफ द सॉफ्टवेयर एंड अगर आपने OBS यूज किया है बहुत ज्यादा सिमिलर है। तो ऊपर से स्टार्ट करते हैं यहाँ पे माय चैनल वाले टैब से। इसमें जो 3 डॉट है इस पे आप क्लिक करोगे तो आप ऐड चैनल्स पे जा सकते हो एंड आप यहाँ चूज कर सकते हो कि आपको कहाँ स्ट्रीम करना है। अब आप डायरेक्ट YouTube पे क्लिक करके अपने चैनल से साइन इन मार सकते हो, बट अगर आप लॉग इन नहीं करना चाहते इनटू द सॉफ्टवेयर देयर इज अनदर मेथड यूजिंग ऐड कस्टम RTMP। और ये कैसे सेटअप करते हैं मैं आपको थोड़ी देर में बताऊंगा। अगर आप उन लोगों में से हो जिनको अपना YouTube या कोई भी Google अकाउंट नहीं साइन इन करना ऑन अनदर सॉफ्टवेयर, वैसे तो काफी सिक्योर है
godly descendant, and afterwards we have got these stories, the Puran sagas,
बट ये और ज्यादा सिक्योर है। अब आपके सामने जब आप सॉफ्टवेयर खोलोगे ऐसे 2 विंडोज बनी हुई होंगी। इसको अभी थोड़ा इजी करने के लिए हम ये बटन दबा के एक विंडो बना देंगे। अब आप देख सकते हो यहाँ पे ब्लैक हो रखा है क्योंकि कोई भी हमने सीन नहीं सेटअप किया। आपका सीन जो भी आप स्क्रीन पे दिखाना चाहते हो वो चीज होती है। तो इससे पहले हम कोई भी फुटेज डाले, फेस कैम डाले, कुछ भी डाले, वी नीड टू मेक श्योर कि हमारी स्ट्रीम हमारे हिसाब से सेटिंग्स हो रही है। तो यहाँ नीचे जो सेटिंग्स है यू कैन क्लिक ऑन दिस। यहाँ पे सारे ऑप्शंस है आपके पास। सबसे पहले तो आपको जाके एनेबल वाटरमार्क को ऑफ कर देना है। इसको आप ऑफ करोगे तो आपकी वीडियो पे कोई भी वाटरमार्क नहीं आएगा। ऑन रखोगे तो वाटरमार्क आ जाएगा। अब अगर हम जाएं आउटपुट वाले सेक्शन में तो ये पूरा डिसाइड करता है आपकी स्ट्रीम किस क्वालिटी में जाएगी। ये बहुत जरूरी है। अब सबसे पहले आउटपुट स्केल रेजोल्यूशन में आपको वो दिखाना है
between the inhabitants of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. This non-standardized 16L runic alphabet used sound values inscribed on stone or wood by Scandinavians. Then there are the runic inscriptions first and foremost in this part of Scandinavia, and they are contemporary, but they have their own special problems because the messages are often very short and concise really. They tell us nothing about society at that time. The runstones used a standard layout of Scandinavian iconography mainly to commemorate the dead and sometimes for magic. Carl Dahlberg is a modern-day runstone carver who lives on Adela Island. This ornament shows a flying dragon and is maybe the most beautiful I've seen on a runstone. Unfortunately, the stone once fell so half the dragon's nose has broken, but we see the eye and the neck goes down here and a beautiful wing here. Then the pay is here with claws and the tail goes down in a circle here and another circle here with some artistic license. The tail is turned into a foot with 2 claws and a small thumb. The run still read starting with the head of the dragon, but this one was different, and here he writes ya in fast gear and her head this stone painted after their father Vora. Then there is an addition FREH and their father, so something very special. Even after the Vikings had become Christians, the dragon remained a key feature of their culture and figured on runstones for centuries. The dragon painted on these runstones is generally tied in some way. Either there is a leash between the neck and the tail that binds the two together, or the leash is interwoven. Here it is interwoven, and therefore it is a sort of rule that if you follow this tail, for example, it goes over next time under the leash, over under, and it has to be like that all the way. So if the dragon tries to flee, it just gets tangled up. Unlike parchment or paper carving, a runstone left no margin for error. Then he cuts the runic inscription that is ordered. He cuts runes after runes, and at the end he writes his father. He forgot the R. He must of course have an R, so the solution is that either he must cut an R here below, where he must place it inside the sentence he then chooses to place it inside, and I know being a rune carver myself that when he discovered that he forgot the R then he got so angry it really bugs him he pulled his hair. How could I do that? And the whole day is ruined. Outside the Scandinavian world, churchmen wrote about the pagan Vikings as a scourge of God, threatening centuries of work building new Christian kingdoms to protect and propagate the faith. The pan-Scandinavian culture that was so threatening to the Christian world was cruel but effective. Only warriors who died in battle made it to the mythical paradise of Valhalla to fight during the day and feast by night. Here the one-eyed god Odin ruled this warrior paradise with the aid of a raven, and the Viking's dead Vikings played board games that simulated battle. The fine game pieces found in the Sima ships were carved with dragons. There were about 325 gaming pieces. Some were fragmented, but still it's a huge number. And there were a few dice made from Tuscan. In general, there are two types of gaming pieces. The game was called Nefu and was very popular in previous Viking and Viking times. So this is a Swedish king who is the main character. Nef means the king's table, so it is the king who is being attacked by the musty enemies. The gods were not necessarily good. The Viking chief buried on Sima Island possessed a luxurious jewel-encrusted sword, the representation of the canine god Fenrir. Tells us a lot about the early Viking beliefs. The dog's father Lori was a famous trickster revered by pirates. Now here we have a very nice sword handle detail, and it's a bit different from the others. We can see a very nice symbol in the form of a two-faced animal. It is possible that it was a mythical hunter, the son of Loki, called Fenrir, with a human face and animal hands. Odin and his brother Thor, whose hammer amulets are present in every Viking excavation, had killed the previous god Eir and made the world out of his body. Odin's family was vast, and if Lori was destined to betray his brother's cousin Freyja had quite a different role. It was Freyja who was both the goddess of war and of love, and when there had been a battle, Freyja was the first to come to the battlefield with her wagon drawn by big cats, and it was Freyja who first got to pick out her half of the men who had fallen. Those that she didn't want went to Odin. In Valhalla, women played a vital role in religion. Here at the Lur Land of Legends Experimental Center in Denmark, a priestess shows how the gods and spirits would be summoned. There were female priests. They had the same status. There were vulvas, for example, vulvas that could see the future and the past, and it is said in the Viraspi saga that Odin himself goes to a vulva and asks her to tell him about the past and the future. Most of pre-Christian Viking religious worship took place outdoors in open spaces and sacred groves. No temples remain, though the German cleric Adam described one at Old Ups in modern-day Sweden as a large feasting hall. Ahmad al-Fatlan was a 10th century Arab traveler along the Volga River in modern-day Russia. Al-Fatlan tells us the Russian Vikings were in open places, often in woodland or by springs. He describes an elaborate Viking funeral rite with the sacrifice of a slave girl and a ship burning. There were two forms of sacrifice known as blot, one in which animals, objects, and at times humans were sacrificed to a god, and the remains would be thrown into peat bogs or springs such as this one recreated here at the experimental settlement at Lyra in Denmark. In another form of sacrifice, the particip ate the meat of the sacrificed animal and company in a common building. All you see here is based on archaeological findings. For example, the horses have been recreated after we found a horse skull, the hoofs and the bones of the lower leg in a Danish bog. The rest was not found, so this is our interpretation. What may have happened is a feast to the gods where the horse meat was eaten, and then they hung up the skin on a support with the hoofs dangling at some point. The horse pelt, and the support decomposed, and the remains fell down into the bog. The idea that a man or woman might be sacrificed to the gods to propitiate some divine intervention went back to the earliest times of Scandinavian history. We have the talented man with a rope around his neck and a belt around his waist, the Hosa woman with all her clothes and equipment like combs that have been carefully laid down in the bog. The Tuan man was hanged to death in sacrifice and found in the peak bog of Seiler in southern Denmark. The remains date back to the 4th century BC. Vikings too threw valuable objects and the bodies of sacrificial victims into bogs and springs like these two 4-year-old boys found in a well at Traer. It was an ancient pagan tradition. 3 Christian clerics described human sacrifices. Among them, Titar of Maid wrote that every N years humans and animals were sacrificed by the dozen at Ly. When Tma describes the terrible and cruel things taking place in Lyre, blood sacrifices and the like, then you have to remember that this is a Christian point of view of pagan traditions. Besides this, Tma was of noble family, and some of his relatives had been taken hostage by the Danish king, so he was personally involved and may not have been completely neutral in his Presentation Adam from Bremen relates what the Danish king Sven Estron has told him, and here we are already in about the year 1000, so there is a big difference in time here, but there is also the fact that we know that different parts of Scandinavia performed different ceremonies first and foremost regarding funerals and events like that. How extensive human sacrifice was is incredibly difficult to say, because then we must be able to define how these people came to lie in the grave. So to speak, the Normans spread westwards to the British Isles and Iceland, taking with them their ancient pagan culture which clashed with the Christian Empire's power. And religion went hand in hand in the merciless struggle that lasted 300 years in Europe. The pagan Viking culture clashed violently with the expanding Christian world, but in Iceland the settlers kept their traditions for centuries to come. Sacrifices were held in a room at the end of the larger louses that served as a shrine. And the banqueting hall was the place where the members of the community came to eat the flesh of the sacrificed animal. The Icelandic law books tell us that the richest farmer, the most powerful man in any one area, would also be the priest. The priests were also the speakers at the assembly of all free men. Here at the Thingr were Icelanders. Is their right to debate public issues, making Iceland the earliest modern democracy in the world. The typical Scandinavian home was called a ale-house. The northernmost of the Shetland Isles has the highest concentration of ale-houses in all of Britain, and was a hub of Scandinavian expansion into the Atlantic. Shetland, and UN in particular, is right in the middle of the Viking seaways, so it's the obvious if you're going from Norway across to Faroe Island, Greenland, or even America, or even up and around, going sort of north about, and then down to Ireland and Man, and that direction. Shetland's right in the middle. Here at Jarlof in the Shetland Isles there is evidence that the early Scandinavian settlers reused the houses built by the original Pictish people who inhabited the islands before they arrived. Initially people came here trading, and that would have been the first contact, and the first contact would certainly have been on that level, and they would have been finding out what it was like in Shetland. As a result of that, we do know that in the end the Pictish people kind of completely their way of life was subsumed completely by the Vikings. Viking society was based on family allegiances and laws. There was a three-tier class system split into a small ruling elite, or jarls, free farmers known as bondi, and slaves. As prosperity increased, the Scandinavian birth rate grew, and family leaders had to find more land and ever greater opportunities for their offspring. Independence, while the warlords left little independent-minded petty chieftain. It seems that prosperity rather than starvation drove the first raids. Ships were expensive to build and required social cohesion. Armor and weapons too took organization, and taking men away from farming during the summer months meant that someone else was looking after the crops. The role of women therefore was key to keeping the community functioning. It was the women who ruled the farm, and as a symbol of that they had keys, and they kept those keys with the rest of their valuables. And since the men traveled out a lot, they were counting on the women to keep music home. Women enjoyed greater political and economic rights than in the Christian world too, as the Lady of Orberg demonstrates, with her rich funeral goods and fine trading ship. When they held a meeting, the people went to those meetings. When they gathered in the small ville ages, the women also had the right to join. That means they had the right to vote. In 793 calamity struck the English kingdom of Northumbria. Raiders of unknown origin attacked the undefended monastery of Lindisfarne and took away everything of value. These men would soon be known as the Vikings, considered by Christians to be a scourge of God, but the Vikings had been raiding and dominating key points on trade routes as far away as Russia long before they officially entered the history, music books. We found 7 male skeletons in the first ship in Somme, and they were not buried systematically. They were located in different places, and in the second ship we found 33 or 34 human skeletons in fragments, and now we know that 10 of these have blade wounds and 6 have multiple injuries. The ship graves puzzled the archaeologists. The battle wounds of the 40 men buried here show that the relationship with the local inhabitants was probably violent, yet the rich grave goods show that there was a lot more to this expedition than pure pillage. These people were killed in battle because we have evidence of that on their remains, especially on hands and legs. For example, we have an upper arm that was hacked in 4 different places. Also we have injuries from swords on other arms, like someone was defending himself with the upper arm. Also we have skulls with obvious injuries. I don't know what those people were doing there. They might even have been a wedding delegation, peaceful visitors, but we really don't know for sure what was the main reason for their being here, and it is very strange that there are so many luxury items, swords, gaming pieces, dogs, birds, and so on, not Typical battle ammunition. The Vikings penetrated the Baltic coastline and traded and raided deep into the East European plain. The routes passed through Styria, Ladoga, North Russia, where finds of Scandinavian amulets and runic inscriptions on wood show that the Vikings were trading with, if not ruling, this strategic place on the Vula River. By the mid-8th century, the Finns, slaves, and eventually the militarily dominant Scandinavians traded here for centuries before the Vikings are mentioned in written chronicles. They founded the trading town of Novara, just sts on the other side of Europe. Other Vikings were plundering Paris. The question is, why does it escalate? Why this sudden rush? The factors that have contributed to it first and foremost are the fact that people then as well as now are opportunistic, in the sense that some areas where the situation was unstable. We must remember that, for example, the Frankish Empire was in dissolution, and not to mention the British Isles. There were lots of conflicts in that area as well. The great Frankish Empire to the south was ruled by Charlemagne, who aggressively expanded his realm. In the late 8th century he began a 30-year campaign to forcibly convert the Saxons, the southern neighbors of the Danes, to Christianity. Pressing north toward the fiercely pagan Scandinavian world, Charlemagne spilled just as much blood as the Vikings. So maybe the Viking raid started out as a military operation, but after a while people discovered that there is money to be earned here, and then it developed into ordinary plunder. Here at Oralness, Haralfair gathered around him a military force that was able to hold together most of Norway. A great battle at Hard F brought him final victory over the petty kings and pirates of Vestfold, and caused an exodus to Iceland. Indeed, it was during the upheavals of the war to unify Norway under Haralfair that we see the greatest Viking immigration. Between 846 and 865 the Vikings attacked both England and France, often taking advantage of the chaos that afflicted the great empire of Charlemagne. The Norwegian Vikings went the furthest of all people in their time, and they went as explorers, not as bandits to rob, but as explorers and tradesmen. All of that comes down to the ship technology they developed. It was a case of life or death. Music. The Baltic and North Seas facilitated the sense of pan-Scandinavian community. Ships traveled swiftly along the coast or across the sea, while land travel was slow and dangerous. It is no surprise, therefore, that expansion into the rich plains of Russia or raiding up the rivers of prosperous England and France was an easier option than cutting the forests and farming the land of inland Sweden and Norway. While early Scandinavian society became more organized and benefited from trade between the far north and the far south, its appetite for wealth earned or stolen grew. Its ability to organize a predatory economy grew with it. Although they instilled terror in their victims, the Vikings were just the more aggressive face of a fast-evolving Scandinavian society whose influence spread from modern-day Canada to the Caspian Sea. The secret of their success lay in their nautical technology and unique social cohesion, which together were a formidable weapon for these empire builders. They plundered lands from Central Asia to North America, and defeated the armies of the greatest empires. They spread the Lord of the Sword while trading and raiding from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean Sea. Their tactics and weapons were the most advanced of their music time. A castle now stands to defend this holy island of Lindisfarne in North England, but nothing barred the way of the very first recorded Viking raid on the 8th of June 793, in which the monks were murdered and the abbey pillaged. The attack is considered today as the first of the Viking era, but as we shall see, the Vikings plundered other parts of Europe for centuries beforehand. The Vikings were fighting machines. They moved swiftly over the sea in speedy lightweight ships. They invested in the best weapons money could buy and the finest armor way into the history books, but today science and archaeology reveal who they really were and why they were so effective in war. Vikings lived in a time of blood, a violent time, and they weren't better or worse than other people at that time. There would perhaps not have been any Viking age if it weren't for the Viking ships. This is our Viking helmet has his armor. It's made from a thick hide that you stitch together. And this was the early stage of in the shortest of word bulletproof vest. The Vikings went into battle equipped to kill spears, swords, and axes, to attack armor, shields, and helmets, to protect their bodies. Their secret weapon was the ship, which carried Nordic warriors all the way from their Scandinavian homes to lands of conquest, from modern-day Russia to the North Atlantic islands and the Americas. The same Viking weapons were buried in graves as distant from each other as Repton in England and Somme on Sima Island in Estonia. Here 40 Viking warrior skeletons were excavated in 2 Viking ships in 2011, a find that turned the story of the Vikings on its head. These light and shallow-keeled Warships were being used for raiding at least 100 years before the first recorded Viking attack. The Gad and Oberberg ships were between 50 and 100 years younger. They were engineered to bend with the sea and withstand rough rapids, yet were light enough to be hauled onto a beach and carried over land. Marit Via is the lead archaeologist at the Oral NES excavation on Karua Island, Western Norway, and an accomplished skipper herself. When the Vikings came, they used ships. Viking ships were light and flexible, and it was said that they moved like an animal in the waves. They attacked suddenly using the surprise tactic, you see, and the advantage of that was they could pull back quickly. Wherever there was a waterway, Viking raiders and traders could go there, traveling from the farthest reaches of their world across the wide open oceans and into the depths of the forests and plains of modern-day Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. The best preserved Viking ship is here in Oslo, Norway. Thousands of visitors come every year to visit the Viking Ship Museum. The Oberg ship was found by a farmer who dug into a mound looking for gold. It took archaeologists 20 years to excavate, restore, and prepare it for exhibition. Jan Bill is the Viking Ship Museum curator and one of the world's foremost Viking ship experts. The Oberberg ship is unique. It is the best preserved ship we have from the Viking Age. Almost everything is present. The Oberbg ship is the oldest and best preserved Viking ship, and as we shall see, tells us the most about the early Viking way of life. Miraculously, the blue clay of the mounds, similar to these at Ballin, had hermetically sealed the burial, leaving wood, leather, metal, and even textiles intact. The other interesting fact about the Berg ship is that it is the oldest sail ship known, which has been preserved. We have older pictures of SA ships from the 700s, but this is the first example of a ship where the technical construction of mast and rigging has been preserved. Archaeologists were stunned to find 2 women were buried in the ship, one around 80 years old, and another about 50. An intricate decoration showing animals and Viking scenes had been carved into a cart, a sled, an ornate bed, combs, chests, and dozens of other sacred items buried with them. Tree ring dating confirms that the great Viking ship of Oer was built in approximately 820 on the west coast of Norway and is the oldest surviving combined sailing and rowing ship. A crew of 30 men plus a helm man and a lookout propelled the ship using 15 oars a side. The ship is 22 m long, and each oar hole is equipped with a shield holder. One of the world's leading Viking ship builders is Vika Bischoff. She is the head builder at the Rosilda Ship Museum in Denmark and built the scale model of the Oer vessel before proceeding to design the life-size replica. The Viking ships are built to be very light and very strong. They are built out of mirror-cut oak, that is, they are split out of whole trunks. The planks are split in such a way that the wood graying is completely even down through the length of the plank, and this means that it's possible to reduce the dimensions. Oak is a heavy and very hard wood, but very strong and flexible when wet, which is why the ships are built out of fresh timber, which is mirror-cut. Bischoff and a team of Viking ship experts set out to build a replica of the Oberberg ship after several setbacks, including one replica sinking. She started the project again, and in 2010 artisans and scholars began using ancient materials to make the planks and reconstruct the Saga Oberg over the course of 2 years using the same wood-carving tools and techniques the Vikings employed to build the Oderberg ship 1,000 years before. The team rebuilding the Oeg ship in Norway worked feverishly through 2 winters to finish the new replica ship. In the spring of 2012, the finishing touches were put on the Saga Osberg. Finally, in June of the same year, an inauguration celebration was held before the entire Turnby community and Norwegian royalty, and the replica was launched with great fanfare from its building site at Tberg Harbor Promenade. As we shall see, the ship represented more than just a unique naval technology. The Viking predators of the seas sailed in amazingly light wooden ships, and a group of experts and enthusiasts have built a faithful replica of the oldest surviving example in Turnberg, Norway. The crew and artisans who have worked so hard to build the replica Saga Oer have come to take her out for a sail in the Oslo Fi Music. I think they had the drawings in their minds. They felt the ship and knew how the ship would turn out. They knew what trees to look for when they went out in the woods and let the tree help form the boat. They had a lot of experience and long traditions. They were artists who knew their jobs and did it properly. Music. The ship's captain illustrates some of the incredible features copied from the original, which show how each ship became home to its mark. The owner of the ship was a revered lady, according to recent forensic Investigations we are also able to see from the cranium that the woman suffered from an advanced stage of a disease that is not genetically transmitted, and which means that the frontal bone thickens on the inside. This creates a pressure on the brain that alters the body's hormone production. The older Viking lady mystified her followers. Her hormonal problem may have contributed to her growing a beard and other gender abnormalities which some believe gave her magical abilities. They carved her image on the ship. We believe it to be the owner of the boat. There were 2 women's corpses in the grave. One of them was a woman aged 81. 5 long with a hunchback, so she was probably about 1 long. Walking, she had an illness that gave her a lot of facial hair and a deep voice. A deep street on the other side of the straits between Norway and Denmark is the Rosinde ship museum, which holds the largest collection of Viking ships ever found in a single archaeological area. The 5 ships salvaged from the bottom of the Rilde Fiat at Skev included not only a trading vessel, but also long ships. Another 9 ships were uncovered while the museum was being built, including the largest warship ever found. At 36 long, the Danish ships here are built from oak, and the Oer ship is built exclusively out of oak. Some Norwegian archaeological finds are built from pine, but in between you may find other wood species like birch, alder, and ash. We have a few examples of beech, not a very good material for ship building. But when we build the full-scale reconstructions, then we do it as precisely as we can, because the Vikings did not use saws. Every piece of wood was cut using axes, taking special care to work with the natural grain. Remarkably large vessels could be built using traditional clinker construction techniques. Dragon ships carrying 100 warriors were not uncommon. Using iron rivets to lay one plank over the one below, they would build a flexible ship from the bottom up. The internal ribbing was made of oak using natural curves and forks in the branches for extra strength. The planks and the ribs were lashed together using blue whale bowline. Maybe the strongest natural fiber ropes on the ship were made of sealskin. The Viking ship rode the waves as a single flexible object, not as a mass of separate rigid parts. All of the rivets like this are made by our own smith, just as the tools are. They are long pins that go in with a square-shaped head sticking out on the other side, and then they hold it steady and pound it until it's fastened. The Viking ships were clinker-built, which means that the whole planks are placed one on top of another with an overlap. In between these overlaps there is a thin woolen thread with tar to make it watertight. The planks lie tight on their own, but as it is all handmade, the wool and the tar help to ensure that it is watertight. They are then fastened with iron rivets, which are then secured on the inside so that they squeeze the planks tight together. This helps to make the hull very stiff in its lengthwise direction, and therefore the ship very strong and completely watertight. Viking ships' sails weighed over 100 kilos. They were made of a special wall deed and grease to make it more waterproof. They were woven by the Viking women who operated the large royal farms back in Scandinavia. The sail was worth more than a ship in the Viking Age, since it took such an amount of time making a sail. So in the law of Guling it said that during wintertime, when the sail is not in use, it should be stored. And in the church the Saga Orberg sail took 1,800 hours to weave. When we look at the grave material from the Norwegian ships that we have, we can see that they are pretty wide and robust, and they used to sail. The Norwegian ships have got a length to beam ratio of 1:4 if we look at the grave material, and that has got to do with the sail, which is not supposed to go outside of the music sides. The first image of a sail on a Viking ship is this from the Swedish island of Gotland and dates back to about 700 AD, but although the Swedes claimed the patent, not everyone agrees. As a Danish professor said, it was the Norwegians more than other Scandinavians that dared to go out on the wide grey ocean without knowing what was to come if they didn't have good ships. While they died, what we know about the Scandinavian warrior, whether a pirate or a member of invading armies, is that he or she bore a few simple but effective weapons and blended into a well-organized team when a big battle loomed. But they also had women and children with them in the battle, and when you've got women and children in a battle, you've got a lot more to fight for. And they used what we call guerrilla tactics. They hid and then attacked. The sources tell us that they used a tactic called the hog snout, and that was something they had learned from Odin. Believe it or not, these Vikings of the YS Viking Association are training in the use of sword and shield. The key to effective single combat was balance, taking advantage of the opponent's inability to react to speedy sword thrusts or slashes. The weight of the sword and the shield tired the arms of the warrior, so the strongest and fastest regularly won individual fights that could not last more than an hour. When forced into a full-scale battle, the Vikings adopted the shield wall, in which each warrior was defended by the man standing next to him, and the shields overlapped to provide continuous protection all along the line. It was a defensive array that most warrior armies of the day adopted, but the Vikings used the hog snout tactic to break through their adversaries' defensive war, attacking a small part of it in arrowhead formation in order to break through and cause panic. Of course, surrounding the enemy and attacking from behind was the preferred tactic if made possible by the terrain or by enemy error. Once the enemy line was broken by thrusting spears, the swords came into place, slashing the enemy from the side and back and spreading terror. One never knew where they might turn up. They were heathens, and this in itself instilled terror. Sources tell us that they used scare tactics to spread fear and panic, and we hear from British sources that the Vikings were considered a punishment from God, and it's obvious that you get pretty helpless under those circumstances. Two great battles that took place in 1066 marked the climax of Viking-era tactics. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England, the Saxon army defeated the invading Vikings when they broke through the shield wall of the Scandinavian force, which had left its armor on its ships. Only 3 weeks later, the same Saxon army was defeated by the Normans at Hastings, a battle described in detail on the Bayeux Tapestry held in France. This time the Saxon shield wall broke when they believed mistakenly that the attacking Normans were in retreat. Safety lay in a disciplined defensive array in Volin. Modern-day Vikings from all over the world meet to take part in reenactments of Viking battles and buy weapons and armor that have been faithfully reproduced on the basis of grave finds, which means that they are probably better equipped than most warriors of the Viking age. Every Scandinavian soldier was required to have a spear and a shield. Eventually, the most basic survival tool, the axe, also became a formidable weapon of war. Spearheads found in graves were of many different kinds. The spear could be used as a throwing and as a thrusting weapon. Volin was probably the site of ancient Jorg, the military base of the elite Viking mercenary unit. By all accounts, they were a well-equipped and trained military force, a private army for hire. They were staunchly pagan. This runestone on the island of Öland off the Swedish coast commemorates a Yams Viking who died in battle. It is the only one to mention the pagan god Odin. Vek Philippak is the director of the Volyn excavations. The written source says that Iber was a huge city on the South Baltic Sea at that time and describes the events in this place at that time. So when we discover archaeological evidence of that kind of a big city dating to the early medieval period, finding lots of artifacts of trade, export, crafts, etc., well, we have no doubts that this is that place. In fact, the archaeological and written evidence shows Volin was much more likely a multicultural cosmopolitan city where religious and ethnic diversity was not a point of music conflict in our culture now. The popular image of the Vikings is unfortunate, with horned helmets, who were cruel people who only attacked others, but the truth is they were not only pirates, they were also tradesmen, colonizers, and they were in every trade hub in the north of Europe here as well. Probably they were a great people. Whether this was the legendary Jomsborg or not, Volin was just one of the gateways into the immense riches of the Central European plain via the wide rivers that cut from the Baltic to the Black Sea, where fearless adventurers could make their fortune and leave their cultural mark. The Vikings raided and traded all along the Baltic coast for centuries before they attacked England, and the Viking ships of Somme on Sarah Island in Estonia tell a tale of war and death. Riley Alma is an anthropologist who worked on the SAR skeletons all gathered together in little gray boxes. Her job is to work out how they died. I think that during battle he fell down. He was attacked from behind, and maybe he fall down. He was fighting, probably because the cuts are in his right upper arm, but in my opinion this upper arm, the hand was somehow fixed, because you cannot make the strokes like this, that they are in the same angle more or less. And finally I found this Gannis one of the bones in the foot I show you, which also means that he should have been lying or something, because the heat is somewhere here, and of course the final has been this decapitation, in my opinion. Most of what we found were weapons, especially swords. There were two types. The first was double-edged, which was the most advanced technology for that period. They were made using damask steels, so the center part of the sword was damask plate, and the outer part was welded to it soft iron and strong steel, and then the blade was twisted so that it became very flexible, and the SAR Viking skeletons were buried with the finest ceremonial swords, a characteristic of the Viking graves for centuries to come. Only the richest weapons accompanied the warrior to Valhalla. Now here we have a very nice sword handle detail, and it's a bit different from the others. We can see a very nice symbol in the form of a two-faced animal. It is possible that it was the mythical hunter, the son of Loki, called Fendry, with a human face and animal hands. These characteristic grave goods reveal just how far the Vikings had penetrated the Baltic coastline and the plains of Russia and Poland when a new motorway was being built here in central Poland. Archaeologists made an unparalleled discovery in post-war Polish archaeology, a Viking Age cemetery with 50 human remains dated to the late 10th century with chamber-like graves at Bura, a place of strategic importance for the first recorded Polish state. Professor Andrzej Buer excavated the site. This is a completely untraditional cemetery. There is nothing like this cemetery in Poland or in the whole of Europe, nor is it a very big cemetery because it consists of just 50 graves. They are concentrated in a small space. Every grave is rich, there is no poor grave. This is the cemetery of upper-class people. In it the central figure was this young warrior buried with his sword. He had been badly wounded with part of his jaw chopped off and a deep head wound. He was buried sitting upright with his sword, so it's important to distinguish the young soldier's grave. He had complex wounds to his skull and mouth. This soldier is extremely interesting because he held a ceremonial sword. This sword is positioned as though the soldier was sitting and he was holding it, and the body had fallen over, and we found him with the sword in front of his eyes. The grave goods, coins, jewelry, and weapons strongly suggest Scandinavian and Kiev Rus roots. To confirm his suspicions, Professor Bua had genetic testing done on the skeletons. The results show the father's side of the warrior's genes appear to have come from Scandinavia. He was not the only man buried with his weapon in this grave, which we excavated. There were 4 items of warrior equipment. These were characteristic because they related to different territories. In one grave we have a Viking's land sacks dated to the end of the 10th century, and the beginning of the 11th century, and the next one we dug up was connected with the Scandinavian community, and warriors from the north and west parts of Europe. The deep wounds on the warrior's head and jaw show he died young and in battle, and like the Sardarmar warriors he was buried with the finest grave, music, goods. The two-edged sword with a half-moon-shaped pommel is also known as a Frankish sword, as it was based on the design of weapons carried by soldiers of the most powerful empire of the time. It was made of steel. Today experts have discovered how these swords were made to be so strong. The basic block of steel that was used to make a sword can be seen here in the L. Long Museum, which holds many of the finds that Professor Mick Jagodinski excavated from the site of the Viking Age trade town of Trousseau. It's true we discovered lots of military things in Trousseau. I mean arrowheads, spearheads, and mainly pieces of swords. They probably produced swords in music. Trousseau. These blocks of steel were the basic starting point for a Viking sword. The iron ore was melted with carbon, either from charcoal, coal, or even burned bones. The ingots would then move on down the production line to the swordsmith, where they were heated and beaten into shape. They became like these swords held in the Stockholm Cultural History Museum. Strong and often elaborately decorated, at times carved with individual names. Trousseau was an important place of trade and craftsmanship. Workshop remains were discovered, including smithery, jewelry, glazier, amber, and horn. Music workshop. Swords made here were prized, and often those buried with warriors were deliberately bent out of shape to dissuade grave robbers. This Albert sword in the Northgard Museum in Russia shows just how far traveled the rich Viking warriors were. It was made in the heart of the Frankish Empire. In Germany the Vikings sought the best swords on the market. Even if sending a sword to a Viking was a capital offense in the empire, dozens of Frankish swords have been found in king graves. This sword is short and one-handed, which was common in the early Middle Ages. It's a very good weapon, very solid and very effective. Everybody wanted to have it because swords were very rare and there were not many in them. Because they were expensive, swords were made of iron and steel. The sword had a very high impact force bent out of shape to just how far traveled the rich Viking warriors. These axe heads were found in Viking graves were powerful weapons, and the weight of the blade could penetrate a steel head. In the heart of the Frankish Empire in Germany, the Vikings shown by these warriors from the swords on the market. Even if sending a sword to a Viking was a capital offense, was a very popular weapon. Frankish swords have not have a lot of metal, so many for this kind of axe was more effective also because it could pull back the shield one-handed, which was common in the early Middle Ages. No matter how strong the sword axe, worthless, solid, and very effective. Everybody wanted to have it because swords were whetstones used for sharpening their tools. The important thing was to have Good weapons, sharp tools like knives
very
and sides,
rare,
and there were not many. Everything that had a blade had to be sharp, otherwise it was a poor tool. The sword had a very high impact for the bent because when used the sword at the museum in Russia shows just how far traveled the rich Viking warriors. Industrialized the Vikings trading them has been found in Viking graves for powerful weapons. With other goods, we know that the Vikings used the wet stones with other tools of the Frankish Empire, and we've got examples of it. The wet stones were used and hung in the belt together with weapons in special sheaths, leather sheaths and skin sheaths, so that they always were ready to sharpen their weapons, make the weapons sharp. Very few items of Viking armor have survived the funerals of the warriors. Chain mail was cost ly to make, each ring forged and closed around another by hand, and one by one it was also heavy to wear, weighing 15 kilos at least. For a form coat plate armor was even heavier. As we see, it was very hard and also very expensive and very rare. This breastplate doesn't protect arms, and it is short. The hauberk which my friend has is long and protects arms, so a great part of the body, but mainly on the chest, was very good also. However, the breastplate was lighter than the bar, so it allowed men to move faster. Many Viking warriors would not have been able to afford armor, and would have relied on heavily padded leather jackets. Instead, they would all have had a shield. The shield was made of wood with an iron boss in the center covering the handle. Many of these remain, and are found in museums throughout Scandinavia, such as here in the Oslo Cultural History Museum. Armor, shield and helmet defended the Viking from enemy blows, but as we shall see, still gave the warrior only partial protection. The Vikings were equipped to kill and dressed to survive. A vital piece of defensive weaponry was the helmet. Probably the most common form was the conical type with nose guards. Some were particularly elaborate. These helmets of the pre-Vendel period, found in a grave close to the Gamla Obala site in Sweden, show how much work went into making beautiful headgear for a rich warrior. They were buried with the man when he died. However, only one Viking-era helmet has been found in a Scandinavian grave at Ringerike in Norway. The elaborate Vendel-era headgear seems to have been ceremonial only, while the Sara Vikings were wearing no head protection whatsoever. This is actually quite classic wound coming from this direction. The second one is here, and if you turn the skull upside down, you can see there is a very clean gut on the left side of your temporal bone. This also means that maybe this is decapitation at this moment. Then when they were attacked, this man, they definitely didn't use helmets. As you see, as the Viking warriors of today prepare for their next battle, the sheer cost of a Viking expedition becomes evident. The cohesion of Viking raiders and armies as a team was an effective weapon. As the early plundering parties became invading armies, their leaders could count on hundreds of determined and fearless warriors attracted by loot. But mounting such an expedition was costly. A ship or several ships had to be bought or made, and each soldier had to be promised sufficient loot to make the weeks away from the farm profitable. Vikings could become rich enough not only to buy their own weapons and armor, but also even to mount their own raids. When the raids became invasions, the English and Frankish states found that simply paying off the Vikings with land or money was easier than fighting them. In 845, the Vikings sailed up the Sa and attacked Paris, while on the other side of Europe they founded the first Russian kingdom. 20 years later, they invaded England and began settling with York as their capital. In 885, they besieged Paris, and in 9911 were given France's western coastline to rule over. On the other side of Europe, they controlled the rivers of Russia and captured Constantinople by carrying their ships overland. The investment in military technology paid off. Now massive profits from the south flowed into Scandinavia, while new power bases were established in the west. The Arab chronicler Ahmad al-Fathan encountered the Vikings of the Volga known as Rus in the 10th century, and described their pagan rituals. And another frightening aspect of their culture, they were tattooed from head to foot. Tattooing is very tight connected to spirituality. We know from the Viking Age that the runes had a lot of meaning. Every single rune had a lot of meaning, and I'm pretty sure that the Vikings had tattoos that included runes who were supposed to provide them with protection in battle. Give them strength, connect them to their philia or power animal and stuff like that. Kuf is a Viking tattoo artist from Copenhagen. He uses ancient Viking techniques, bone needles and traditional tools to decorate the skin of his clients with Viking themes. At Viking festivals, the tattoos are done just like they were in the Viking Age. They ornament everything, so like a door is not just a door is room for decoration. A knife handle is not just a knife handle, it's room for decoration. And so is the body. A typical Viking tattoo. I think what I have here is what I'm pretty convinced is very close to how it actually looked back in the days. The same with my leg here. So again, when we go for example to the Scythian or all traditional tattoos, it's always pretty tough black work. While tattoos protected the Vikings from the evil spirits, they could not fight in the open. The weapons they bore gave them physical supremacy in the real world. The Viking conquests from Russia to England reached their climax with the last great raid by descendants of these Scandinavian warriors. William, Duke of Normandy, and later King of England, was a direct descendant of the Northmen who conquered half of France when he invaded England in 1066. His army was larger and more powerful than most of the time. So yes, actually the Duke of Normandy had a very powerful army which consisted of Normans but also French, and we can see that the word Frankie is written on the tapestry, I'd say in black and white. So he had a large army, about 8,000 men crossed the Channel. The Bayeux Tapestry was a celebration of the Norman invasion which represented the ultimate stage of development of the Viking raid. Details of the scenes of preparation for the invasion are meticulously recorded on this tapestry. The investment in troops, the prize that William and his lords were pursuing. The lords who followed William to England made donations, and of course in return they expected booty and gifts of land that had been conquered. The Bayeux Tapestry is a remarkable representation of late Viking Age ships. Weapons and war. We see ships the way Vikings built them, that's to say ships with shallow hulls propelled using oars and that have a sail that can be raised on the high seas. We also see weapons that were an inherit from the Vikings, which are also shown on the tapestry. They are long axes, a Danish tradition, which are handled by the Anglo-Saxons as seen on the Bayeux Tapestry. Loot and booty were the driving force behind the Viking raids. For nearly 300 years war was a way of life for these predators of the north who left their mark across Europe. From the farthest steppes of Russia to the northernmost tip of the British Isles, they came out of nowhere to plunder and murder. From the shores of Scotland to the Caspian Sea, modern archaeology and science reveal for the first time the real driving forces behind the Viking raids from the Russian plains to the North Atlantic. While Viking enthusiasts of today live the life of the Scandinavian warriors and fight set-piece battles at the Festival of Olin, scientists and archaeologists from all over Europe are making groundbreaking discoveries. Recent research shows the Vikings from a new perspective and in the brutal social context of their time, spotlighting their incredible ability to plan and execute their expeditions for maximum profit and psychological effect. At the time when the Vikings attacked, there was starvation in England. There were dragons in the sky. When the Vikings came, it was like a part of the punishment from God. They'd been pushed into the top of a ditch, and they'd been very seriously traumatized at death there. Their bodies were very hacked about, legs, arms missing, the vertebral, second vertebral body indicates some decapitation marks. As you see, there's a clean cut through a cervical spine. To hear the story of the Vikings takes us to Sima Island in Estonia. Here a team of archaeologists from Tallinn excavated an amazing cache of Viking artifacts that turned the history of these Scandinavian pirates on its head. Yuri Pits excavated one of the most impressive Viking burial sites known to experts today. The remains of more than 40 human skeletons in 2 boat graves were unearthed in 2011 during road construction. We can say for sure that it was a battle grave and that there was a sort of big battle. 40 bodies in 2 ships, that says it all. The battle had to be hard. We can see vicious wounds on the skeletons. Some, for example, have hacked hands and broken skulls, so it was hard and they had to bury those victims fast. Tallinn researcher Riley Alma is studying bones of the Samar warriors and how they died. The skeletons all showed signs of violence, deaths and multiple battle wounds. The upper arm has cut into 4 pieces. There are more than 4 cuts into the bone. The hand position or upper arm position could have been some like that, because some of the strokes are in the same direction, in the same angle, and then the position has changed. When the team from Tallinn applied modern dating techniques to the SK, they were shocked by what they found. Analysis of the items we found, including the skeletons and the organic material, shows they go back to previous Viking times. Incredibly, the ships and the bodies date back to at least 100 years before the first recorded Viking raid, yet the weapons, the shape of the ship and artifacts buried with them prove that the men found in the 2 boat graves came from Scandinavia. These 40 bodies show that Vikings were raiding at least a century earlier than scholars previously believed. We can be sure that these men were Scandinavian sailors who somehow met their death at Sal. As we shall see, the Viking Age was one of incredible brutality, and the ferocious battle that raged on the beach of Surima must have been major if 40 warriors were hacked to pieces, and then respectfully buried by their comrades. I think that during battle he fell down, he was attacked from behind, and maybe he fall down he was fighting, probably because the cuts are in his right upper arm, but in my opinion this upper arm the hand was somehow fixed, because you cannot make the strokes like this that they are in the same angle more or less. And finally I found this gannis one of the bones in the foot I show you which also means that he should have been lying or something, because the heat is somewhere here. And you, of course, the final has been this decapitation. In my opinion, archaeological evidence in Russia confirms that Vikings raided but also traded along the great rivers of Eastern Europe at least as early as the mid-8th century. Adrian Saline is a researcher in early Russian history at St. Petersburg University, Russia. No one knew what was in ancient Russia. Everyone knew that somewhere around the Caspian Sea they were minting silver coins, and that they could be exported to the rest of Europe in unimaginable quantities, and it was area between the Baltic and the Caspian Seas along the Volga River that was the first to be colonized by Scandinavians. Here at Staria Ladaga on the shores of the Valav River, tree ring dating of wooden objects such as this stick carved with letters of the Viking alphabet called runes shows that Scandinavian traders and warriors appeared here long before any mention of Vikings in the written chronicles. With regards to Sta, we can see that Scandinavian artifacts dating back to before the Viking Age have been found in the oldest of all the sites in the area of Staria, the ancient chronicles known as sagas and runic inscriptions in Scandinavia have given a name to these men whose exploits went unrecorded for centuries before they slashed their way into the history books. They were the Vikings. They were men and women who, safety of their home, explore and plunder distant lands from modern-day Poland, Ukraine, and Russia to the islands of the North Atlantic, and as far as America. The Vikings spread not only terror but also a web of trade. The mystery of where the Vikings came from and why they attacked has now been revealed. Scandinavian warriors had begun plundering coastlines of the Baltic Sea and Atlantic Ocean early in the 7th century. By the end of the 8th century they had occupied the northernmost of the British Isles, plundered Scotland, and dispossessed the indigenous population. The PS whose monuments still stand on Orne today. Well, I'm sure initially people came here trading, and that would have been the first contact, and the first contact would certainly have been on that level, and they would have been finding out what it was like in Shetland as a result of that. However, and you get objects appearing in the Pictish context showing that kind of link. The degree to which it did or didn't become aggressive we don't really know. Here at Iho on Shetland, the way the Vikings reused Pictish dwellings is clearly visible. What happened to the locals remains a mystery. Sometime in the 8th century warriors from Norway came here and the Pictish culture disappeared. The term Viking really only applies to the very first settlers who came, who were in that initial exploratory, possibly raiding phase, which maybe in Shetland perhaps only lasted as much as a generation. I don't think it's as black and WH as either you were a raider and a pirate, or you were a farmer and had your own industry or soapstone industry or whatever it was that you did. I'm sure that all these roles were mixed up together, and it's not clear-cut. The Vikings probably used Hatandran tactics to raid coastal and riverside communities in Scotland and Ireland for decades before they attacked a monastery in northern England where they found more gold than they could imagine. But they did not come for plunder alone. A titanic struggle was underway, pitting the Christian empire of Charlemagne against the last pagans of Europe. The holy island of Lindisfarne is cut off from land during high tides. Today tourists flock here for the seabirds. Monks first came here because it was isolated in the distance. The Northumbrian castle of Bamber was close enough for the holy men to exert religious influence and receive protection. No one expected the vicious attack of the 8th of June 793. Chronicler Alcuin of York commented, "Behold, the church of Street Cuspit spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments, a place more venerable than all in Britain is given as a prey to pagan peoples." Alcuin of York, however, was far away in Ain, the capital city of the greatest empire of Europe, ruled by Charlemagne, champion of the Christians. Charlemagne's drive northwards and the 30-year-long forcible conversion of the Saxons to Christianity brought his empire to the very edges of pagan Denmark. Inevitably, Christian chroniclers were the sworn enemies of the pagan Vikings, but according to Marit Via, the lead archaeologist at the royal palace at Orad Nes, Norway, the pagans may have been reacting to Christian atrocities at that time. Charlemagne was conquering territory after territory. Europe and Charlemagne's war, while his culture minister was Alcuin. He had been to Lindy's Fan Monastery. For instance, the first attack known to us was at Lindy's Fan Monastery. So one theory is that the raid was a response to Charlemagne's aggression.
और ये कैसे सेटअप करते हैं मैं आपको थोड़ी देर में बताऊंगा. अगर आप उन लोगों में से हो जिनको अपना YouTube या कोई भी Google अकाउंट नहीं साइन इन करना ऑन अनदर सॉफ्टवेयर, वैसे तो काफी सिक्योर है बट ये और ज्यादा सिक्योर है. अब आपके सामने जब आप सॉफ्टवेयर खोलोगे ऐसे दो विंडोज बनी हुई होंगी. इसको अभी थोड़ा इजी करने के लिए हम ये बटन दबा के एक विंडो बना देंगे.
Armies against each other, the opportunity to attack and pillage into the heart of the empire was too great to be missed. The great river S flows into the English Channel and leads all the way to Paris. In 841, Danish Viking Asgar sailed up it with 13 ships less than 1,000 men and burned down the city of Rouen. He went on up the river to the magnificent monastery of Zier, where he ransomed the monks. The Vikings stayed for the winter and ravaged the countryside the next year too. In 845, the city of Paris itself was looted by a certain Ragnar. The Viking raids continued for the next 30 years. The Vikings avoided facing the Franks in battle, but more often they were paid either to leave or to fight each other or serve as mercenaries. They were also given land in the northern Netherlands, and in the re-history in exchange for their military services, we can't ignore the shock and the violence. The Northern relations between the Scandinavians and
हमारे हिसाब से सेटिंग्स होती हैं. तो यहाँ नीचे जो सेटिंग्स है, यू कैन क्लिक ऑन दिस. यहाँ पे सारे ऑप्शंस आपके पास. सबसे पहले तो आपको जाके एनेबल वाटरमार्क को ऑफ कर देना है. इसको आप ऑफ करोगे तो आपकी
exchanges when they found resistance in France, the Vikings turned
कुछ भी डाले. वी नीड टू मेक श्योर कि हमारी स्ट्रीम हमारे हिसाब से सेटिंग्स हो रखी है. तो यहाँ नीचे जो सेटिंग्स है, यू कैन क्लिक ऑन दिस. यहाँ पे सारे ऑप्शंस आपके पास. सबसे
पहले in England at the time, North Raya stretched from the Scottish border to the Humber River just south of York. It was divided into two subkingdoms, constantly at war with each other, while the middle of England was occupied by Mercia. The kingdoms of East Anglia and Wessex occupied the east and west of the country. Divided and mutually hostile, they were unable to put up resistance to what initially was little more than a Viking nuisance. The part-time warriors of the English kingdoms were no match for the determined Viking music predators. In 865, the four leaders of the great heathen army Iva Hallan Alba and Guam landed in East Anglia and began a 20-year reign of terror. They captured York on All Saints' Day when both rival kings of North Raya were celebrating the Christian festivity. They practiced the blood eagle torture on one of the kings after killing the other in battle and marched on to conquer the rest of England. York became a Viking capital for a century, but what the history books tell us isn't always backed up by archaeology, says Peter Connolly, the director of the excavations in the Hungate quarter of the city. We talk about the archaeology of York as being Anglo-Scandinavian, so you have the Anglo-Saxon aspect and that Scandinavian aspect, and it's very difficult to tease those apart.
अब अगर हम जाएं आउटपुट वाले सेक्शन में तो ये पूरा डिसाइड करता है कि स्ट्रीम किस क्वालिटी में जाएगी. ये बहुत जरूरी है. अब सबसे पहले आउटपुट स्केल रेजोल्यूशन में आपको वो दिखाना है जो आप अपनी ऑडियंस को दिखाना चाहते हो. तो अगर मैं चाहता हूँ मेरी स्ट्रीम 1080p में हो तो ये 1080p होना चाहिए. अगर मैं चाहता हूँ 720p में हो तो ये 720p होना चाहिए, डिपेंडिंग ऑन आपका पीसी कितना अच्छा है, आपका इंटरनेट कितना अच्छा है. मोस्ट लोग मेरा इंटरनेट अच्छा है 1 Gbps है तो मैं 1080p पे स्ट्रीम कर सकता हूँ, बट आप 1080 या 720p रख सकते हो. डाउन स्केल फिल्टर में बाइक्यूबिक एंड लैंग्सोस में से चूज कर सकते हो. इसके ऊपर आप अलग वीडियोस देख सकते हो. मोस्ट लोगों के लिए लैंग्सोस इज अ बेटर वन एंड कॉमन FPS वैल्यू इज आप कितने FPS पे स्ट्रीम
gathered around a central grave dated to 873 by a Saxon coin. It was the year Iva died nearby at Heathwood. Hundreds of small tumuli suggest that this was the Viking military cemetery. In the same year, one of the other Viking leaders, Hallan, raided into Scotland, but left some of his warriors to build farms. The Vikings were here to stay, but despite what the Christian chroniclers wrote, the impact on the tiny population
and common
of
FPS
England
value
was
is आप कितने FPS पे
imperceptible. We're not talking a massive population, hundreds of thousands. Say for the
स्ट्रीम करना चाहते हो. गेमिंग यूजुअली 60 FPS में होती है. अगर आप 60 करना चाहते हो 60 कर सकते हो. Although 30 is slightly easier on your PC. Again, आप ऑनलाइन जाके देख सकते हो कि आपकी इंटरनेट स्पीड जितने भी MBPS पे है उसके लिए बेस्ट स्ट्रीमिंग सेटिंग्स क्या है. अब इस वीडियो को सिंपल रखने के लिए हम आउटपुट मोड को सिंपल रखेंगे. ऑल्दो अगर आप थोड़े से भी सीरियस अबाउट स्ट्रीमिंग तो आप इसको एडवांस पे जाके यू कैन सेट एवरीथिंग प्रॉपर्ली, बट फॉर मोस्ट पीपल जो शुरू कर रहे हैं हम सिंपल पे रखेंगे. अब वीडियो का बिट रेट भी आपके इंटरनेट पे मैटर करता है. इसको आप 6000 से 9000 के बीच में रख सकते हो. यूजुअली 8000 मोस्ट लोगों के लिए एक अच्छा स्पीड स्पॉट है. आप अपने इंटरनेट के हिसाब से और आपके काम के हिसाब से देखिए आपके लिए क्या बिटरेट सही रहेगा. अब यहाँ पे एनकोडर में आपको दो ऑप्शन मिलेंगे, हार्डवेयर NVENC एंड सॉफ्टवेयर X265.
Alfred's military reforms left Wessex better equipped to fight the raiders. He instituted the first standing army in England and a series of fortress towns known as burghs where the rural population could seek
अब यहाँ पे
refuge.
encoder में आपको दो ऑप्शन मिलेंगे, हार्डवेयर NVENC and सॉफ्टवेयर X264 and अगर आप NVIDIA ग्राफिक कार्ड यूज कर रहे हो तो यूज हार्डवेयर NVENC, anything else just use सॉफ्टवेयर X64. हम NVIDIA ग्राफिक कार्ड यूज कर रहे हैं तो हम NVENC में रहेंगे. एंड यहाँ पे आप रिकॉर्डिंग, जो अगर आप इस सॉफ्टवेयर पे स्ट्रीम यहाँ रिकॉर्ड भी कर सकते हो तो आप अपनी रिकॉर्डिंग की सेटिंग्स यहाँ डाल सकते हो. अब इसके बाद आप अपने ऑडियो में जाकर डेस्कटॉप ऑडियो माइक्स, अगर मल्टीपल माइक्स है वो सेटअप कर सकते हो. विजुअल में आपका बेस कैनवस एंड आउटपुट कैनवस. बेस कैनवस होता है आपकी डिस्प्ले. अगर मैं 1080p मॉनिटर में सब कुछ देख रहा हूं तो 1080p मेरा बेस है.
Isolated British settlement in the heart of PSH Scotland. The population was enslaved.
1080p for most people.
Sent to Ireland on the east coast of Scotland, the Vikings attacked
अब हमें अपनी सीन्स को सेटअप करना है. तो जैसे कि अगर मैं चाहता हूं मेरी स्ट्रीम में मेरा फेस कैम रहे इन द स्ट्रीम, तो all I need to do is go here अपनी सीन 1 में go into sources and add a webcam or a video capture
Such
device.
as the new kingdom of Strathclyde, famous for its stone carving school in Denmark and Norway. The territorial expansion of new ruling dynasties pushed nobles who
गेमिंग
refused
करना
to be
चाहते हैं
subdued
यूट्यूब
to
पे
seek
तो
their
लेट्स
fortunes
मेक
abroad.
अ
The richer
गेमिंग
the plunder,
वाला
the more
सीन.
they invested in
तो हम प्लस
ships and
करेंगे
men
यहाँ
to
पे
mount
सीन 2
ever
का ऑप्शन है,
larger
इसको हम
attacks.
कर
Each
देंगे
Norwegian
गेम
valley
स्क्रीन.
had its
तो सबसे पहले तो हम जाएंगे सोर्सेज में, क्लिक करेंगे प्लस एंड यहाँ पे विंडो कैप्चर खुल गया एंड आई कैन चूज एनी ऑफ द सॉफ्टवेयर जो अभी खुले हुए हैं. मैं यहाँ पे रहने वाले हैं. ये मेरी
the first kingdom of Norway from here at Ol Nes on Camo Island. What is certain is that all of Harald Fairhair's royal estates were located in Rogaland and Halland, and even though all other places were ruled on Harald Fairhair's behalf, he himself only had the full control in these 2 counties. What was happening in the Viking heartland affected the extent of the Viking raids in the east and west. The Viking onslaught against England and the Frankish lands was driven by politics as well as by lust. For plunder opponents to Harald, those who saw no profit in paying tribute to him and serving as soldiers in his army may have taken to raiding and exploring the North Atlantic instead. The hundreds of fjords were perfect places to hide, and plundering the rich coastlines of England and the Frankish Empire or sailing to Iceland must have seemed more attractive than serving. This upstart Danish chieftains served as mercenaries for the warring Frankish kings and were invited to occupy Freya, opening the way to attacks further down the continental coastline. They brought home not only plunder but also ambitions to rule as kings in their own homelands. In 947 politics in Norway led to strife in England. Defeated by his English-educated brother Harald Fair's son Eric Bjelex found refuge among the Scandinavians of York. The nobles of North Hryja rebelled against their new Saxon king Edredin, and elected Eric king in his place at Rippen Cathedral. Edred reacted mercilessly, and ordered the cathedral burned, terrifying the rebellious nobles into surrender. The Norwegian Viking was killed in battle after a second attempt to gain the throne. So if we think about Eric Bjelex, he is disposed of the king of the area in 954a, and it's around about 960 into the 970s that we see a whole new suite of development in Hungate. The area Hungate is in Jorvik now. It really is expanding past it, and that then continues right through into the 11th century. We have to bear in mind how Scandinavian societies developed. They themselves were the result of interaction with outside societies, but this too is subject to debate because we can't imagine that all the stimulus for evolution comes from outside, as has been said, but there were developments within Scandinavian society too. Swedish raiders dominated the Baltic Sea from Lake Mälaren and the islands of Gotland and Öland. These 2 large islands with their vast coastlines were perfect bases for raiders into Central and Eastern Europe, and a halfway house for the markets of Hyabb and Birka. The market towns filled with goods plundered from the plains of Eastern Europe and stolen from the cities of the West. A large number of treasures found on the islands of Öland and Gotland, now on exhibition in the Stockholm Museum, show how profitable trade and plunder was, and how even from the earliest times the Vikings sought the most transported wealth available at the time: bronze, silver, and gold. They sold or stole furs, wore ivory, amber, and slaves. The Vikings had been raiding and trading along the rivers of Central and Eastern Europe for centuries before their first raid was reported in the West. As far as I know today, the widespread belief is that the appearance of the Vikings in Eastern Europe is linked to their interest in silver that goes back to the West and East. Among the places Wolfen visited was the great city of Trosso, whose remains Marinsky found 20 years ago while riding his bike Home, as I said, Trousseau was set up by the Scandinavian newcomers on the frontier with Baltic peoples and slaves. The objects which we found in Trousseau are mainly Scandinavian, but we have ceramics, I mean clay pots from Western slaves, and also pots made by Baltic Rus people. The Viking warlords dominated this Baltic trading place, turning it into a military base to supply traders and warriors on their expeditions deep into Eastern and Southern Europe. Alongside articles of daily use, Marek Jagodinski found a large quantity of swords. Trousseau was a hub of the Viking web of trade and pillage. In my opinion, we see a sort of globalization. We find the same crafts, the same Arab coins, the same weights everywhere from Britain to North Russia, so there was some kind of unification, and this unification was fostered by trade and craft. Here in Trousseau, this unification was fostered by trade and craft. Here in Trousseau, local craftsmen worked amber, made cones, swords, jewelry, tools, and processes, and as labor in the port, the trading emporia stretched all along the Baltic coast from present-day Rostock to the Na River where St. Petersburg stands today. The Slavic peoples who inhabited this vast area lived in simple village cultural techniques. They were easily dominated by the predatory Vikings. On the other hand, there is a widespread belief that the largest portion of goods exported from Eastern Europe to the Caspian Sea with the aid of the Scandinavians were slaves. It is even said that in the 10th century the Arabian slave markets were full of slaves from Eastern Europe. The Vikings turned their military outposts into market towns where traders paid them for protection. The Scandinavians forged new trade links between East and West in 841, while in France the Northmen were burning down one, a Scandinavian warrior. Rurik and his two founded the kingdom of Novargi. They were invited by the Slavic tribes of present-day Russia to give them peace and protection. The finds here at Rov Garage, Novgorod show a significant Scandinavian presence. The Viking artifacts that have been found in the Novgorod area are connected both to trade, not only weapons but also scales and silver in the Scandinavian grave, which suggests that the dead person was a trader. The impressive rivers and lakes of northern Russia were the heart of the early Viking conquests. Lake Ladoga is still a shipping thoroughfare, and the Vav River flows into it, rising at Lake Ilmen 200 km further south. The Svir River in northern Russia is one of the waterways that still today connects the Caspian and Baltic Seas. Weapons such as axes and swords from Novgorod and Staria Ladoga show that these were not only thriving trading centers but also military bases. We have to say that very few Scandinavian weapons have been found in the Novgorod area, while objects to do with trade and everyday life have been found in great quantities. We should also say that Russia is crossed by many rivers. Travel was by river mainly, and the Scandinavians were traders. 50 years after the first recorded raid against Lindis van, Vikings had penetrated the Eastern European river system as far as the Black Sea. Rory's successor Alec moved his headquarters down the Dnieper and seized the town of Kiev in 907. He captured Constantinople by dragging his ships around the sea defenses in 911. In the same year the Vikings gained Normandy as their new home in France. Alec struck a trade deal with the Byzantine Empire, turning Kiev into the capital city of a great ruling dynasty. Part of the deal was to provide mercenaries to the emperor as his own personal bodyguard, known as the Varangian Guard. By now half of England and much of France was ruled by the Vikings, but this was not the end of the Viking raids. Iceland sits halfway across the North Atlantic Ocean, the most dangerous sea for Vikings to cross, and yet by accident or by design Scandinavians landed here already in 840. Add later political upheaval at home led to an